And I want to welcome you all today and thank our co-sponsors at the Asia program and the Environmental Change and Security Project. I also want to thank the sponsor of this seminar series on urban poverty, the USAID's Urban Programs team. And I wanted to let you know that this is a 2-year seminar series we've been running on issues related to urban poverty. And our final meeting will be on September 24th, and there's a flyer outside if you'd like more information. And I just want to welcome today our panelists. We're really happy to have them here with us. And I'd like to introduce Richard Stren. He's Emeritus Professor and Associate at the University of Toronto's Centre for Urban and Community Studies. Richard has been a very important member of the Urban Studies Project's Advisory Board and has helped guide our programming. And we are grateful that he is here today to moderate this panel. So, Richard, I'll let you.
Okay. It sounds like I'll have to moderate something very conflictual, although I don't really think that's going to happen. It will be, however, a real treat to hear the speakers that I'm going to introduce in a minute. But before I even get to introducing them, Allison just mentioned that this project has had a couple of phases. The first phase involved having major meetings elsewhere in the world, and some were held in North America and some were held outside. I myself was involved in a big one, which was on decentralization in Senegal and West Africa, and that was actually held in December of 2003. There was one in Maputo, there was one in, I think, Durban, South Africa, there was one in Brazil, etc. There have been that was one of the first phases of the project, and these phases of the project brought in local people and focused on some important subject that was significant to them in terms of urban policy and urban development. Over the last 2 years, there have been a series of really important seminars, something like this, often with 3 or 4 or even 5 people participating, many of them coming from outside. And some of the first of all, they dealt with urban services. They dealt with housing, they dealt with water and sanitation, another dealt with security and crime. One dealt with transportation, another dealt with access to land, another dealt with planning. These are very, very significant and crucial urban services that were discussed pretty extensively in these meetings that were held in the Wilson Center. Also, there were different approaches to urban development. There was the discussion of governance, there was a discussion of diversity and migration, what difference that made to urban development. There was a discussion of decentralization, poverty and marginality, sustainability. A very big discussion, which I remember very well, was on slums and the informal sector and whether there were alternatives to this pattern, which is becoming more and more entrenched in many countries. But thinking about all of them, which I was doing last night, just as after I got here, I realized that almost all of them turned around infrastructure in some way. Infrastructure is what keeps the city together, or doesn't, alternatively. And infrastructure involves both social and intellectual and political networks of people. So people are infrastructure in a way. Their networks constitute a form of infrastructure, as well as physical infrastructure. And without physical infrastructure, such as sewers and roads and water mains and electrical connections on the one hand, and even internet connections, mobile phone connections, etc. All of that constitutes the necessary physical infrastructure that makes cities work and keep them functioning. And they are, as I've said, the essence of what is a city. And if they don't work, the city doesn't work. And as I was thinking about this, I remembered when I was, a long time ago actually, in Dar es Salaam, when my wife, who didn't know how to drive, was trying her driver's license test in a little kind of dusty office off one of the main roads in downtown Dar es Salaam. And because I was the husband, I was allowed to sit with her during this test. And the question was, she had one question which she had to answer, and then she had to go out and drive. But the question she had to answer was the following. Name 5 parts of the car which, if they don't work, the car will not go. That was actually the question. And my wife looked at me and she said, the motor, and I was allowed to participate in this, I should say. And finally, she did manage to satisfy him, but it reminded me actually of the city. I mean, this is what infrastructure is. Infrastructure, if it doesn't work, the city isn't going to work. Or it's not going to work very efficiently and coherently and productively. And maybe when we anyway, as I drive my car, not that it breaks down very often, I sometimes am reminded of that story. And it's very hard to say why infrastructure is so important, but there are different ways of thinking about it. Certainly we can think about the productivity of cities. But if we think about the productivity of cities, the first thing it seems to me that comes to mind is the fact that cities are largely, at least in many of the countries that I know, are made up of very poor people. And when infrastructure fails, or when infrastructure doesn't exist, or when people don't have access to it, when they don't have access to good transport, or when they don't have access to water, when their sewage system, sewerage, I should say, system backs up, etc. They have to walk. They don't have backup generators when the electrical system fails. They get ill a lot more often when the sanitation system does not exist, or when it fails, or when waste isn't removed, and when their access to doctors or any other medical facilities are very limited. So it's the poor who suffer the most, and the wealthy can insulate themselves, obviously, against these failures of infrastructure. So infrastructure is really important from the point of view of the poor, just as in general it's important as it affects productivity as measured by lots of other things. When infrastructure is poor, investment, whether overseas or local, is discouraged. And sometimes when it's not there, conflict results. The social science literature looking at infrastructure, or the infrastructure crunch, or the failure of urban infrastructure to keep up with the rate of migration, which is always much, much higher than the level of production of infrastructure, the rate of the overall level of urban growth in cities in the developing world is over 2%. I think it's 2.2 the last time I looked, and whereas in northern cities it's about 0.1 or 0.2%. So it's many times the rate of urban growth and this is just population growth, it isn't necessarily physical growth, which may be even more extensive than in the north. So that literature focuses mostly on failures and is mostly critical, and it's mostly negative. So the story one reads in the big books, and books that have recently been published, such as, for example, Planet of Slums by Mike Davis, or Shadow Cities by Robert Neuwirth, books like that tell a story which is pretty discouraging and pretty negative, and mostly they are stories about failures of infrastructure. But there's another side to this, because infrastructure isn't always an absolute disaster. People are responding to the failure of the state or the failure of local government to provide the necessary services they need. They're doing that on their own. They're doing that along with governments. They're doing that along with assistance agencies in lots of very complicated ways. There are some positive stories that are out there, but we don't hear them very much. And I think it's our privilege and a great fortune to have two people here with us today who are going to tell us something a little more positive about what's been going on the infrastructure side in very different ways. Let me introduce the two speakers to you before they speak, and then I'll turn the floor over to them. The first person who's going to speak is Mr. Arif Hasan, who's directly to my right and your left. He's an architect and planner. He lives in Karachi, and he's very, very important in the urban field, not only in Pakistan but internationally. He's been a consultant to the very famous Orangi pilot project, and it has attracted a great deal of international attention. In 1990, as the bio says, he was awarded, he was given the Shelterless Memorial Award by the Japanese government. He's been on steering committees for that award, and he's been recognized all over, and not only among practitioners, but among academics like myself, as one of the people who is putting his money where his mouth is. He's on the ground. He's helping and advising people to do something about the disparities which they live with. And he's been making a very big difference, and I'm sure he would say that he's not the only one, which is true, but he's energized that process, and we're very lucky to have him with us. The second person is a person that I've known for quite a long time, actually. I think we've known each other since 1981, if I'm correct. Personally, and the first time I ever saw Michael Cohen, who's sitting on the far end, was in Senegal when he was giving a seminar to a bunch of people who were involved in the first Sites and Services project to be developed in Africa and possibly, by the World Bank anywhere. And Michael came out to greet me. He was in a room with others, and he came out to greet me, and we met. And but I think the group had to, I remember this rather vaguely. It is about 30 years ago. But he came out of the room, and the group was starting to go. They had to go someplace, but they were dismayed because Michael was out talking to somebody, and they wanted him in the room. And they started calling Michael, Michael, Michael. He was very, very important. He was playing a very important role because he was training and working with the first group of people who were operating this new Sites and Services project, which, as he's going to tell us in his paper, had a much longer history than the actual project documents expected. Michael is now a professor of international affairs and director of the graduate program at the New School University in New York. And he's built that program up from nothing, actually, and it has 300 graduate students now from 62 countries. And I know Michael takes them on trips or organizes them. Maybe he doesn't go on all of them himself. On research visits around the world, which is a very important part of that program. Michael's significance is not only, however, as an academic, because before that, as I said, he was working in the World Bank, and from 1972 to 99, he was for a long period during that time, I'm not sure exactly the years, he was head of what was called the Urban Development Division, I think that's right, and it was the focus of all of the advanced thinking and imaginative projects in the urban field that were being done at the bank. Michael was Mr. Urban during that time, and he brought so much energy and so many of his own ideas and commitment to that division that it became the real center of initiatives for urban throughout the world. And since then, I think when we think back on what the bank is even doing now in urban and what other agencies are doing, I think that was a high point in urban development internationally, and we have Michael to thank for it. Michael has a doctorate in political economy from the University of Chicago, and he's done a lot of things outside of just being working for the bank and working at the New School. He's was president of the IIED and International Institute for Environment and Development, and he was on a couple of panels at the National Academy of Sciences, one on infrastructure and another one on urban dynamics. The urban dynamics one I know because I was involved in that too, and we produced a book called Cities Transformed in 2003, and Michael was a very, very important member of that panel. Anyway, these are the two people you have the good fortune to hear, and I will pass the gavel now over to Arif Hasan, who is going to tell you about some of his experiences in Karachi. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. First of all, I'd like to thank the Woodrow Wilson Center for having invited me. And I'm here because of their persistence and perseverance in getting me an American visa, which took a rather long time. So, before I begin my presentation, I'd like to say that I was thinking on how to make this presentation. Should I talk about the larger issues of sanitation and relate our work to it, come up with some conclusions, or should I tell the story of Orangi? And I decided to tell the story. The only problem with the story is that the story becomes longer and longer with the passage of time, but the time given to illustrate it always remains the same, 20 minutes to half an hour. So I will try and condense this, raise a few questions which I think can be discussed later, and I'll talk about Karachi very briefly. It's a city district divided into 18 towns, and the towns are divided into union councils, and there are 178 union councils. Population is about 14-15 million now. It is 10% of Pakistan's total population and 20% of Pakistan's urban population. One very important thing that maybe we can talk about later is the age group of 15 and 24 years. This age group is completely different from the other age groups, which I think is extremely important because it's a new world, I think, that is being born, which planners normally don't realize what is going to happen 10 years from now. It's a literate age group. And I think for the first time in the history of South Asia, we have a very large adolescent population, because the married women in the age group of 15 and 24 has fallen from 43% in 1981 to less than 20% now. I think it's a very important factor, which we can talk about later. Now, the important thing with what I'm going to explain is that the annual housing demand in Karachi is 80,000 units. And in 1999, the formal sector was producing only 26,700. Now it must be about 32,000 or so. And this demand-supply gap was met in informal settlements, which are called slums. We don't use the word slums. We call them informal settlements. And more than half the population of the city today lives in these informal settlements. And in these informal settlements, there are evictions, for which there are very important reasons. Important to us because we work in this setup where mega projects, often funded by international financial institutions, and are responsible for these evictions. There is a powerful politician, bureaucrat, developer nexus with its enormous land hunger, which is responsible for it. And now global capital is increasingly responsible for these evictions. We can discuss this also in questions and answers. The government has been operating an informal settlements improvement and regularization plan since 1973 with loans from the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. And we have improved and regularized at the rate of about 1% per year, which means in 100 years we'll regularize all the settlements. And there are various reasons why that regularization and improvement doesn't take place. They are listed here: no community involvement, poor recovery, lack of capacity, complicated procedures for regularization. And this means increasing foreign debt because we've been regularizing with foreign money. And our research, which has been published, shows that these IFI-funded programs are not sustainable. Now, Orangi is a Karachi town, and it has a population of 1.2 million. It's almost all informal settlements. And the Orangi pilot project was established here in 1990, basically to overcome the constraints faced by the government in regularizing and improving Kachi Abadis. The objective of the project was to understand the problems of Orangi and their causes, through action, research, develop solutions that people can manage, finance, and build, and provide people with technical guidance and managerial support to implement these solutions. And in the process, we hoped that we would overcome the constraints that government faced. So participatory research showed that there were 4 major problems. Sanitation was a priority with people, employment, health, and education. And we developed programs around all these 4. I will just deal with the sanitation issues. In 1998, we upgraded the project into autonomous institutions, and the Research and Training Institute deals with housing, education, research, sanitation. This is the settlement, the newer parts of it. And this was a major issue in 1980 when we started working there. It was sanitation. So we developed a methodology, and we carried out social and technical research to lower costs. We challenged all engineering standards, developed our own. Engineers were not happy with it. They weren't happy for 20 years, but now they accept them. So, passage of time, things change. And then we held meetings with the community, and we informed them that we can help them in providing technical assistance in overcoming the problem. And so, if they applied to us, we would provide them with technical assistance. So on the request from Elaine, surveys were carried out by our team, and maps and estimates were prepared and handed over to a community-elected, selected, or nominated lane manager. This was the first estimate that we prepared, which was 6 months after we started working there. The first lane took 6 months before it agreed to build a sanitation system. The lane manager collected money from the people and organized work. We never touched the money of the people. They used it themselves, they kept it themselves. Normally it was an older woman who kept the money. It seems people trust women more than they trust men, so it was interesting that it was always an older woman. And after the work was complete, the lane was transformed, before and after. The lane was transformed. But it was not so easy. There was a lot of substandard work that was done by the communities, and we had to launch a huge extension program with pamphlets, posters, meetings to tell people how to build. Today, about 100,000 houses in Orangi have built their neighborhood sanitation systems by investing about $1.64 million US. And local government would have invested about $10 million US for this work. All sewage discharges into the natural drainage system. And infant mortality in the areas that built their sanitation systems in 1983 has fallen from 128 to 37. These are the surveys of the Khan University. But of course there were many other factors apart from just sanitation. But we believe sanitation was an important one. And the OPP investment versus people's investment is 1:28. It was 1:15 in 1993, but over time it has increased. People's investment has increased. Now the people's sewage system drained into the natural drainage system as for the rest of Karachi. And this was a major problem with the government agencies. And we told them that the sewage of poor people is no different from that of rich people. So if the sewage of rich people can go into the drainage system, why can't the sewage of the poor people go into the system as well? And we had solutions for this. And so the OPP and the communities, armed with OPP designs and estimates, lobbied with government to convert the natural drains into box trunks with treatment plants at their ends. The treatment plants have not yet come. And the government has been carrying this out, not only in Orangi but in other areas as well. So these major drains have been converted into box trunks. Now the engineers are very unhappy with this, but then we found out that the Japanese had been doing exactly this after the Second World War. And we got Japanese engineers over to Karachi to discuss this issue. And it was a fascinating discussion because the Japanese engineers had never heard of many of the formulas that were produced before them by the Pakistani engineers. And so the engineers in Pakistan were more or less satisfied, yes, that this is possible. This is what shows you what the situation is today in Orangi. Now, on the basis of the work that we did in the first 4 or 5 years, we divided sanitation into internal and external. Internal development consists of sanitary latrine in the house, underground sewer in the lane, and collector sewer. External development consists of trunk sewers and treatment plants. Results in Orangi and 322 other locations in Pakistan have demonstrated that communities can finance, manage and build internal development provided they are organized and are provided with technical support and managerial guidance. They collect money over a long period of time sometimes when they are very poor communities. It probably takes them a year before they get the money to do it. But that process of collecting money and organizing gives them enormous strength and changes their relationship with government agencies. And local governments can support the process by building external development, provided they accept the concept and train their staff in OPP RTI methodology and in working with communities. Now, the scaling up of this program has been done by local government building external in sanitation in Orangi, government agencies and departments adopting the OPP RTI concept and methodology, and by NGOs and CBOs who have been supported by the OPP, which has led to partnerships with local governments. And there's been a lot of involvement of academic institutions in all this simply because me and 2 of my colleagues have been teaching at universities. Our main change came when we started collaborating with the Sindh Kachi Abadi Authority in 67 settlements. They adopted this pattern, the Orangi pattern. They made regularization, they took regularization to the communities rather than asking communities to come to them by forming community organizations who determined how money was going to be spent, and which completely changed the whole manner of doing things. But more important was what happened through NGOs and CBOs all over Pakistan. And we've had many failures before we came to this pattern that I'm going to explain. Our strategy of working with NGOs and CBOs outside of Karachi is basically that community activists from there contact us. We invite them for orientation to our office in Karachi or direct them to one of our partners. After orientation, their activists convince their community to adopt the program, and they create a team of a social organizer and a technical person who are trained at the OPP or on site in their settlements. The training is in surveying, mapping, estimating, construction supervision, documentation and accounts. Training does not have a specific period. It continues throughout the life of the project. OPP arranges financial support for the team and related expenses through water aid. Initially, it is about $200,000 US, 3,500 a year. Then it multiplies, it becomes about 3 times more after 4 or 5 years. Invariably, the CBO NGO comes into contact with local government departments as its work expands. When that happens, local government representatives are invited to the OPP RTI for orientation. If they are convinced, they send their staff for training. Neighborhood settlements contact the CBO NGO for replicating the program, and so far about 40,000 plus houses outside of Orangi in 11 Pakistan towns have built their internal sanitation. Just to give you a view of things, this is in Faisalabad. This is the team. He is the leader, and he was an electrician working for a local government department. He still works for them, and they have done more than 4,000 houses so far. This was his lane. This is what it was like before. This is what it is now. This was the first lane. This was a very interesting project because a politician initiated it. And from the very beginning, it was a partnership between the local communities and the government agencies, local government. And the interesting thing here was that it was not for low-income settlements. It was for the whole town. It's a complete town. This is in Rawalpindi. It was a housewives group that got together. They wanted to do something about their sanitation. And they have reached out now to more than, I think, 3,000 houses. And she was the one who initiated it. She is a councillor now, and she's going to run for the mayorship of a union council in the coming elections. So this was her lane, and this is what it is like now. But the most remarkable thing in all these projects, there are lots of them, is this ancient city of Uch, where architects were working in conservation, and they contacted me, and they said they wanted to do something for the city. And we got these 2 young men involved. One was a draftsman, and they today are advisors to the local government on development. The entire city now has a sewage system, which people have contributed to, and they are also participating in the restoration of the 126 monuments in the city. Then what they learn is remarkable, how they pick it up. They learn the use of computers. These are plans developed by some of the CBOs. Some of them are good at making maps. Others are good at doing propaganda of their work and promoting what should be done. Others are good in technical things. And because they had different skills, we created the Community Development Network, which consists of all these people. And they meet every 3 months at a different location. And they independently contact each other and get support of each other for their work. Only problem is now they have become so many that it's difficult for us to meet together, and we are deciding that it should be at a provincial level because it can't be at a central level. The number is too large. But the most important thing that changed our relationship with government was the youth training program. It consists of training young people in surveying, documentation, designing, estimation, on-site supervision, and community mobilization. These are all from the communities. So far, 42 persons have been trained and 18 are under training. Now, the result of this program is that we were able, through them, to document 336 out of 539 settlements. They have been surveyed and mapped with their physical and social infrastructure. And 52 of the 63 natural drains carrying 80% of Karachi's sewage have also been documented. Now, the spin-offs of this were that we got to understand the drainage system of Karachi and how it functions, which nobody had ever documented before. And as a result, we were able to develop an alternate sewage plan for Karachi which needs no foreign loans except for treatment plants. We were able to change major changes in the ADB sewage plan for Orangi. We managed to get the ADB loan for Orangi wastewater management program cancelled. And these groups have been able, these young people have been able to prepare Union Council handbooks for mayors and community-backed sanitation proposals for Orangi towns. I'll mention this later. And then we created the Technical Training Resource Center, which I will also explain. And through this whole process, we developed extremely good relations with the KWSB and city government, the water company and the city government, although previously we had very bad relations. They really hated us and we didn't trust them, but after working with them over a period of time, we got to understand each other, and we have very good relations now. We try not to take our quarrels to the press or to the TV networks as we used to before. So this is the sort of work that students did. And this is the proposal that we made. And I'll just mention this proposal. You see, Karachi has 3 treatment plants. Yet the sewage all flows, it is planned to flow into these natural drains. It is planned to flow. It's not an accident. The city has planned it like this. And these treatment plants, as a result, they receive no sewage. And so this appeared absolutely ridiculous to us, because to take the sewage to these treatment plants would mean digging up the entire city, which was proposed, by the way, and relaying trunks and establishing loads of pumping stations all over the place to make it function. So this is the KWSB, which is mad with rage, because all the sewage is going in different directions and it's sitting on the treatment So treatment capacity is 151.5 mdg, and what is treated is 40 mdg. And this is how the rest of the sewage goes into the sea through these natural drains. And the natural drains have become higher than the sewage system because they've not been cleaned over the years. So this is the result in many places. So this is the mapping that we did. It's a synopsis of our mapping. What you see in black are all the drainage, natural drains through which sewage flows. And we have about more than 1,800 maps which illustrate all this. And this completely changed the whole manner in which the sewage system of Karachi was thought of. And then there was the ADB funded project for Baldia and for Orangi. I won't go into the details, but in Orangi we managed to change it. In Baldia it remained as it was, and you can see the difference. Government investment. Houses served. government investment in rupees per household, and this is what it is in the case of Orangi. Now this was important, this project, because it demonstrated to us that we could work at a city level also, and that we needed to some very major reform in thinking in terms of sewage and also water, but I'll only deal with sewage. Then there was the Orangi wastewater project. It was a $100 million project. We revised it and we brought it down to 20 million. Now the reason why it came down to 20 million was simply because we documented the existing infrastructure, which the people and informally government agencies had built slowly over the years. It was in a bad state, but it could have been rehabilitated, and all of it flowed into the natural creeks. And we did not lay any trunk sewers. We said, no, we can use these creeks. Okay. So this was the documentation of that. Then we set up the Technical Training Center, which was set up by graduates of the youth program. It trains young people and supports the union councils and communities, and is self-supporting. We got them an endowment, so they don't need money at all. Now, the repercussions of this model has been basically that the Sindh Kathiawadi Authority has become financially solvent. Previously it functioned entirely on IFI provided loans. It's going back to it, by the way, for different reasons. It's the change that has taken place in Pakistan over the last few years. And then the important thing was that in 2006, the government of Pakistan asked me to prepare the sanitation policy. And that sanitation policy was very much on the lines of what we had learnt about sanitation in Pakistan. And it has been approved by Cabinet. But of course, a policy is pretty useless unless there are strategies associated with it, and there are rules, regulations, and procedures which have still to come. And then the OPP's low-cost program for Karachi has been accepted. And there is a big mapping initiative that we have launched in the smaller towns of the province of Sindh. So mapping has become the way now. We have learnt that it is through mapping that you can motivate communities, that they can understand their situation. So it's all about mapping increasingly. And then we created the water and sanitation network in Karachi of CBOs, academics, NGOs, and I'll pass over this. And these are the sort of plans that we've been preparing for the agencies. And I can say that, this sort of work cannot be done by conventional engineers. They don't do it. There is some block towards it. Nor by conventional surveyors. We've tried them all. It is these communities who know their areas, know the people who live there. Once they are trained, they are able to do this. I'll pass over this. But this was all about sanitation, but it's not really all about sanitation. It's something much bigger. It's a change of relationships. And we realized that we needed to go much further. So we set up the Urban Resource Center in 1989. And this was set up by teachers of architecture and planning, NGO activists and community leaders. And it would have been completely useless, this center, were it not for the fact that we had all these communities with which the Orangi pilot project had worked with who could be involved in this center. And the center is basically a research and advocacy center. And it has challenged many government projects. It has made many proposals. It has succeeded in much of the changes it has proposed, failed in some. It has fought evictions successfully. Also, it has failed in some. And there is a strong involvement of the universities in the center. So it brings together a whole lot of people. And it is because of the work of the center and the Orangi pilot project together that a Karachi network is in the process of emerging. These are the organizations that work with the Urban Resource Center now. These are the NGOs. There are 38 CBOs. They are media organizations. And it's interesting that these media organizations, I mean, mostly TV channels and major newspapers, they cooperate with us. Our point of view is invariably carried, to the extent that there are 2 channels that have said, here you are is a reporter and a cameraman, and 2.5 hours on the TV channel, you do whatever you like, you produce whatever you want, and we will show it. So this is really the result of a lot of work behind it. Now, you have groups like the Minibus Drivers Association, etc., Tankers Owners Association. Anyway, I won't go into the list of it. But, you know, there are also a lot of government departments that are now very close to us, who were very distant from us once upon a time. And the reason for that is the National Institute of Public Administration, where bureaucrats are trained. And we became the trainers of bureaucrats, part of their course. And you know how things happen. The reason why this happened was that the founder of the OPP was an old bureaucrat. So that is how it began. Then it stopped. Then my sister became director of the National Institute of Public Administration, so it began again. So it's a lot to do with personal relationships. And it is from these relationships that we were able to get a lot of things done. But politics changes, and all political changes bring with them setbacks sometimes. Sometimes there are benefits also. And so we have understood one thing, that you have to work with the middle-level bureaucrats. And this is something that my colleague Parveen Rahman, who really runs the project now, I have very little to do with it except something ceremonial. She has understood this very well. And she says, we don't want to meet the managing director. We don't want to meet the mayor. We have to work with these middle-level people because they are going to stay. The others keep changing. And finally, this is what it's really all about now, which it wasn't when it began. You have politicians, planners, and people, basically, the 3 main players in this game. The politicians have links with powerful local and national and international interest groups. Planners are supported by academic institutions, international agencies, and donors. And people are small, formal, and informal interest groups. By the way, this I had made PPP simply because we made a presentation to the Prime Minister, and her party was called the Pakistan People's Party. So it sounded nice. And she noticed it immediately, by the way. So that is what the purpose of it was. What is happening is really that politicians and planners get together to give development to the people. And in my thinking, this zone of interaction is directly proportional to this distance. And I think what happened in the Soviet Union was the planners and politicians became one, and the distance became infinity. This is my view after having worked there. What we are trying to do is to create this space and create it, nurture it, and ultimately institutionalize it. I think we've managed to create it, but it is a very long distance, I think, before we can institutionalize it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You don't have an overhead, or probably just turn it off. which I'm a bit afraid to do, but
caught the PPP right away.
okay, Michael.
Let's put this. Thank you very much, Richard. It's a pleasure to be at the Wilson Center. I'd like to thank Allison and her colleagues, Blair Rubel and others. We worked together well before in the preparation of Habitat 2. We put a book out on preparing the urban future. Well, here we are. We see that it's still going on, many of the issues, and it's great to be here. It's also for me a real pleasure to share the table with Richard, who, as you said, we know each other for a long time. And I've always been an admirer of Arif's work. I think we met 20-some years ago, and recently we had the honor of having him at the New School, where he was talking with our students about experiences in Karachi. I want to talk about the evolution of urban work and use the example of Dakar, Senegal, as an example, a little bit as a metaphor for how it's possible to change a perspective over time and how, in fact, learning can occur. I was reminded as I arrived in Washington this morning that 35 years ago this week, I showed up in Washington to start working at the World Bank. And I was enthusiastic, and I knew that I was going to start to work on a project in Dakar, Senegal, which had been approved by the bank's board in June of '72 as the first bank work in urban problems. And at the time, the then president of the bank, Robert McNamara, had asked at the board of the bank, what will this project do? Will this project increase migration from the rural areas? Will it really reach the poor? What will happen? And I had been working on Francophone Africa and ended up getting a job in this big institution, knew nothing about it, and it really started a journey of discovery. And what I wanted to talk about is a little bit, many years later, having said, what is it possible to learn out of this process, but also what is it possible to learn about the aid process itself. I want to start off, though, by observing that I think there are enormous stakes in this question. That is to say, somebody just turned the lights on brighter, or feels like it just got on.
Shining directly in your face.
But I don't know. It just feels like it just started here. I don't know. By the year 2000, if you look at the evolution of aid to cities in developing countries, and you observe how the World Bank became very active starting in '72. By 2000, the bank had programs, finance programs in 7,000 cities and towns in the developing world. These projects included infrastructure and housing, municipal development, social services, environmental services. If you add in the other donors, USAID, UN Habitat, the bilaterals in Europe, the Japanese, the Saudi Development Bank, many of the others, the urban portfolio, if you will, that is collection of work in cities, had reached 11,000 cities and towns. And when I think about the scale of that, it's extraordinary. It's a very large thing. And you might even say that this was one of the really unusual social experiments of the 20th century, right? Without sounding too grandiose about it, but there really have not been programs started in so many places with so many similar objectives to try in some sense to support some process of urban development and to address urban poverty in many countries. That said, the truth is that we know very little about what happened. We know that there have been many projects, and in many places, as in the case of that Arif spoke so eloquently about Karachi, we know that there were things that were started. We know that a lot of money was allocated and approved, etc. But we know very little about the impacts of what actually happened. And that's disturbing for several reasons. First, one would assume that in many cases the countries borrowed money from the World Bank, from the Inter-American Bank, from other places to carry these things out. Secondly, for those of us interested more in the professional practice question, it's important to know whether what you tried to do actually made a positive difference or not. You worry about what the impact is on the people in these countries, particularly poor people. And so I would argue that there are enormous political, institutional, and intellectual and professional stakes in the question, what happened? And what do we know about this? Having left the bank in the World Bank in 1999 and having moved to New York and learned about another life and another world, I began to reflect on my own experience with more intensity, and I had the good opportunity to interact with a lot of graduate students who were asking actually similar questions, sometimes quite unrespectful. So did it work? Why? What happened? How do you know? Whatever happened there in that place? All these kind of questions. And finally, we were able to organize, in one case, a group of 8 students went to Dakar, Senegal, which was the first urban project supported by the bank. And they spent 8 weeks studying the neighborhood that had been created. I'm very happy, actually, that the team leader of that group, Sarah Cooper, is right back here. Why don't you just wave? Sarah led that group as a graduate student. Now she's working here in Washington. And what's interesting about this project is that it demonstrates both the ambition of what the international community might try to do and some of its own weaknesses and problems, but it also raises some of the interesting stakes about aid in general, about the question of aid effectiveness. So this project was a sites and service project, which meant that the bank was financing through a loan of about $8 million, about 14,000 plots of land, 150 square meters each, intended for 10 people per plot. Water services, 1 water faucet per 100 families, very basic sanitation. This was intended to truly be low-cost infrastructure, and people would build their own houses on this land. It was very modest. People were very nervous about this, but it reflected the theory at the time that coercive architecture through the form of so-called low-cost housing was no longer appropriate. We were going to look. The bank would support, with the government of Senegal, another alternative. Well, the government of Senegal was at best ambivalent about this process. The government was interested in bulldozing slums in the downtown area. It was interested in continuing to subsidize middle-class housing, civil service housing. And somehow the bank had argued that this was a useful thing to do in a site somewhat out of town. And the project, which was approved in June of '72, languished for the first several years. It was difficult to get all the legal agreements in place. It was difficult to get the bidding documents, all of these things. And increasingly, this became what was known as a problem project. It received a disordinate amount of management attention from directors, from Mr. McNamara himself, from the board. Everybody was saying, this doesn't work. This is too ambitious. This goes too slowly. Households have not moved onto the plots. When they move, they don't have the resources to invest in improving their housing. This is a problem. And in 1982, the project was officially closed, and it was evaluated, that is 10 years after the fact. And the conclusion of the evaluators in the bank and this was shared by the government of Senegal, but the evaluators in the bank said that this project, by virtue of it was too complicated because it was providing too many services and too many social services, and households didn't in fact move there. It was too complicated, too ambitious, too slow, badly designed, poorly implemented, not something to be very proud about. However, the evaluators noted two points. One was that for every dollar of assistance, of public money that had gone into the project, $8.2 of private investment had gone in housing. So something had gone on that was vaguely hopeful, but it wasn't confirmed. The other comment was made that more than 100 Senegalese who were working on low-cost housing had actually been trained in this process, and that there was some sort of legacy from the project. Well, when we sent our team of students 35 years later to go back and look at this neighborhood, the project had by the time it was finished its implementation process, had reduced the number of plots to about 10,500. There were supposed to have been about 100,000 people living in this neighborhood. 35 years later, there are almost 500,000 people living in this neighborhood. This project, this area is a highly attractive neighborhood in metropolitan Dakar. It's a place where there's a lot of multi-story buildings, there's some employment, there's some schools, and the density, this much higher density, I would argue, is a very important indicator of the relative attractiveness of this place compared to a lot of other possible housing solutions and neighborhoods in Dakar as a whole. So why is it that the 8 evaluators, 10 years after the fact, concluded this was a failure, but if you look at it 35 years later, you see something good has happened here? How do we understand this difference in perception? And what I would argue is simply that the factor of time is extremely important, and that what we have done typically in the aid process is to believe that when we evaluate the inputs to aid, that is, when the money is dispersed, okay, and we've looked at too narrowly at so-called the implementation of a project, we have rarely looked at the longer-term developmental impacts of what's going on. And so we simply don't know. Those people who live in places look at projects and they have their own visual experience and they say, this is a place that's happening. If the people who were walking around the Parcelles Assainies sites and service area in Dakar concluded, this is a vibrant place, this is an exciting place to be. If I had my choice in Dakar, I would like to live here. And in fact, the students reformulated the question by saying, and they came to the bank in February of 2007 and presented their conclusions, one of the students observed, we're not really interested in projects, in the effectiveness of projects. What we're interested in is what is the quality of the place that the project contributed in the making of. Because in fact, what urban projects really are about is placemaking. Is placemaking in a broader urban sense. And so to what extent, how has the project helped or hindered or affected or influenced what's going on in this place? And in fact, in Arif's pictures of the consequences of Orangi, it's clear the significant, what he showed us were places that had changed. And in fact, it's not just a physical change, but it's a political and social and institutional change. These places have a future that they didn't have before. So the comment that I would make is that the evaluation, the long-term look, has enormous payoffs. And what I want to do just for a moment is tell you a little bit more about Dakar. I probably should have brought some pictures, but let me just describe a couple of the findings. First of all, the density is 5 times higher. The population is 5 times higher than expected. Now, you would say over 35 years that would be reasonable. There should be people moving into this place. So what are some of the consequences? First of all, the infrastructure is manifestly insufficient. They're populated. We need more infrastructure, but it's not too bad relative to other places. There are not enough social services. There are not enough clinics and hospitals and schools. But one of the students who was interested in Islam, in the impact of Islam in Dakar, discovered that there were 55 Quranic schools built in this project area. There were 26 mosques. And when we went back to the appraisal report, none of the space for these schools and mosques were included. So what's going on here? Why is it that the project planners didn't think about those very important institutions that would be part of the social fabric? When I look back over my library of appraisal reports from all of the international aid agencies, I almost never see the space required for religious schools and mosques and churches and other facilities. It's an observation that's significant, I think. We also find that these communities, and Richard had mentioned mapping, and Arif had mentioned mapping, that the mapping of how people use this project area, this neighborhood, was also quite interesting. We had a conversation, and in fact what's happened is this is a female-dominated neighborhood because most of the men are overseas working. They're working in Europe, they're working on Fifth Avenue in New York, maybe they're here in Washington by now. But one of the deputy director of town planning in Senegal made a very interesting comment. He said, we have urbanisation dépendante, dependent urbanization, by which he meant that public infrastructure and public goods in Senegal are provided by the donors, largely by the aid agencies, by the European Union, by the World Bank, by the UN, by the French, and that private investment comes from remittances from these overseas workers. And that in fact we have a form of urbanization in which there is no local economic machine to generate the surplus required for urban investment. Well, this is very, very interesting and also very disturbing. Because if you can see this, imagine this in one city, you can certainly imagine it in lots of communities in different places. And I'm reminded, for example, of the $40 billion of remittances that are sent from North America to Latin America every year, and you sort of compare that to the aid flows to Latin America, and you say, well, how is this affecting the urbanization pattern, and how do we understand those things? So the observation here is that there are things to be learned in looking back and trying to understand development impact. I want to make a couple of analytic observations and then a couple of policy observations. The first is that what the students discovered is primarily focused on the fact, and what you could see visually, is increased density. So how do we understand density? If we look at urban projects, and we look at in shelter and infrastructure and in sites and services and housing and in general, density is a critical issue because how many people per unit of area would determine the engineering standards. It would determine the affordability if one was pursuing cost recovery. It would have an enormous impact on environmental quality, on social quality, on physical quality. And so density in the early days of project design was an absolute number. 35 households per hectare or whatever it was. What I think we learned, what the students learned in Dakar, was that density had become a relational concept. It wasn't an absolute number anymore. The density was 5 times higher than expected because in relation to the other possibilities that people had, people moved in to this particular neighborhood. So the density changed from becoming a physical concept, if you will, and a technical parameter, to becoming a behavioral indicator of something else that was dependent on other things. And I'm not sure that we could have understood that if we had tried to study the project 5 or 6 years later. But if we had looked over time, we would be able to capture how, in fact, a physical variable is affected by social behavior. And I think that is very telling in the way we think about cities. because we know that cities are constantly changing and evolving in terms of land use, in terms of their economic, physical, and social meaning of places. So I think this raises some very interesting questions that deserve some research attention and policy attention. But there's also an operational question that arises from this. The World Bank and the government of Senegal were frightened by the experience of this project. They were in the bank. People who had worked on the project were told you had worked on a failed project that had impact on their careers, that had impact on their perception of what they had been doing. And the government of Senegal could see that the external community wasn't happy with what happened with this project. So the bank didn't really get into the housing business anymore in Senegal. The bank has had 6 or 7 projects since that first project. It's focused almost entirely on local government strengthening, and it's done apparently reasonably well. It's talked some about mortgage finance, but it hasn't really gotten into the question of urban form and urban space. And as a result, the space of metropolitan Dakar has grown in a way that I would argue is absolutely inefficient. We now have very long transport distances, unnecessarily long transport distances. And if in the 80s somebody had understood what might have been going on with this project in a more specific way, the land use, the recommendations about urban form would have changed. And I would argue that, going back to the question of urbanisation dépendante, that Dakar is a less productive place, its form is less productive because of the reaction to this project, to this experience. And that's a very, very sad outcome. And I think that it suggests that we need to understand the broader impacts of projects on policy and on operational strategy and how they affect cities more generally. And presumably in the Karachi case, whether you're talking about the sewage system or the famous transport case in Karachi, that urban form is very much affected by these kinds of discussions and perceptions about what is happening with individual projects and how these things work. Now, to make it worse, I think that these projects have a certain kind of local impact which is far greater than can ever be understood here in terms of distance. You know, this is before the days of Google Map, but here we are, or Google Earth. Here we are, way back, so far away from these places, and the reality is that in the aid community, we have very, very, very limited local knowledge. Recently, I was in an office at the UN, and I saw a bumper sticker which said, global knowledge, local results. And I looked at that, and I said, now what's missing from that? Local knowledge. Right? Doesn't say whether the local results are good or bad, but global knowledge, local results. Okay, and it seems to me that what is clear is that without local knowledge, you don't know whether you're improving the situation or hurting it. So these kinds of questions, I think, are quite critical. So to move towards a conclusion, I think my general observation is that we know historically that cities change over time. We know that individual neighborhoods and interventions, and whether it's from aid or locally generated, are somehow absorbed into urban fabrics and evolve over time. And that it would be a very important thing for the international community to do, to look at how these experiences have evolved and what can in fact be learned. I would argue that there's a gap, if you use the Dakar case, there's a gap between what was understood in 1982 versus what's understood now. And if we could use long-term evaluation and then go back and look at short-term evaluation, that might help improve our techniques of short-term evaluation. It might improve our project design approach. And we, in fact, would be able to do this work, which I still believe is very passionate and important work, in a much more effective way. Let me conclude with a couple of more general remarks. In the last couple of months, I've had the opportunity to go, in addition to going to Dakar and looking and seeing for myself what was happening, I was spending some time in China, and I was looking at how there's been this enormous construction boom in China, and how it really is beyond what I would call the global formulation of the urban. Right? If we look at the last 10 major international reports on cities, whether it's UN Habitat or the Bank or the Ford Foundation or the National Academy of Sciences, there is, I would submit, a global formulation of the problem, which has about a dozen or 24 characteristics. Cities are spreading out, demographic growth is going on, infrastructure is not getting much better, environmental quality is going down. There are a series of generalized facts about this. And somehow, I don't think that what is going on in the case of China actually fits in that global formulation. So I say, what could be wrong with global formulation? That is, the Chinese case seems to demonstrate, and Arif and I have talked about what's going on in some of the other Asian cities, there's a process of global capital affecting these cities. And I would argue that we haven't really, for example, looked at how global capital formation is occurring in these cities. So a question for people living in Washington is to think, how is the subprime mortgage crisis in the U.S. going to show up in Karachi or in Beijing or Shanghai or other places in terms of global capital. And I think a global capital formation is a very interesting thing. It's also interesting in the case of Dakar, if you think of dependent urbanization, which is increasingly tied to the global economy and remittances and other kinds of things. So my sense is that we need to get away from a simply project neighborhood view of what's going on here and place the city into a broader global context to understand some of these dynamics, which seem quite strong. When you go to a place like Shanghai, where I had been in the 80s, and you see that there have been literally 4,000 multi-story buildings been built since 87 in Shanghai. You say, where did all that capital come from? And what's this process, and why is that not included in the global formulation of the urban? Right? That's hardly discussed. Why are we missing? How are we missing that, and how can we can connect back to it? So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, we've been treated to two great presentations, and they must have raised a lot of questions, or you must have a lot of comments, or you must be thinking about what they said, and you must be formulating some questions. So I'll open the floor, and we have about 3/4 of an hour to an hour to talk to the presenters, ask questions, and have a discussion among all of us, actually. So who wants to start? Yes, could you say who you are, just and so we can also hear? Okay, getting a microphone.
Yes, my name is Ziad Al-Haddad. I'm the former Director of Operations with the World Bank, just retired. My question is to Arif, Hasan. There were two sets of figures you gave which were rather impressive, stuck in my mind. One was the efforts at Orangi, which clearly were very much more efficient in terms of outcomes and outputs against the inputs, because you gave figures about what it would cost the government and what it cost actually in your own project, the way you did it, on one side. On the other side, you also gave some dimensions on the staggering nature of the gap between the supply and demand. Huge gaps, huge requirements. Obviously, to a person like me and to many others, I'm sure it brings forward the concept of replication. Are the concepts which you have put in place in Orangi and to some extent extended into the Sindh projects, are these replicable in the country as a whole? In Karachi, because where you talk about the Kachi Abadis being 50% of the population, are we dealing with a problem that cannot be resolved with the size which you envisage in Orangi and such operations? Or are we looking at a hopeful future in which replication is possible and these problems can be solved at a much larger scale?
You know, Orangi and its scaling up is a drop in the ocean. Although it's huge, but if you look at the problem in Pakistan, it is a drop in the ocean. And it has taken many, many years to reach this stage. Let's say it took about 15 years to really mature. This can only be scaled up nationally if you have effective municipal institutions. There is no other way. And effective municipal institutions cannot be created simply by this process of decentralization that we have gone into. As a matter of fact, this decentralization has badly damaged effective institutions. Because what we have learnt is that between the elected representatives at the local level and people, you either need participatory institutions or you need a bureaucracy that has a level of independence. So I would say that unless there is reform in local government, serious reform, which accepts this methodology, I don't think we are going to go very far. I mean, we've got a housing policy now that is all about this process. But you need institutions to take it forward and implement it and to involve people in it. Have I answered your question?
Right here.
My name is Farouk Tabal, Cities Alliance. I have worked a long time with Arif, and I don't have much questions on what he has presented, but I have to share with you a reflection. What he just said actually is what I want to talk about. It takes a long time to have this process mature, and what I found very impressive and quite special to Karachi and to the Orangi pilot project is that the NGOs that you have been working with and the communities have had the stamina to work during all these years and keep working without losing hope until we have seen through your presentation government and other institutions have joined the process because they have seen the result. Is this an example that other countries where the issue that you have just raised of the efficiency and effectiveness of municipalities is even worse, is this something that you think could be replicated and how this could be done in these countries? Michael, we are also discussing the Dakar experience that we believe should be expanded to other cases and countries and cities. I have also a reflection here that I already shared with him, but I would like to state it here more publicly. When we talk about long-term evaluation of something, we are of course talking about something, especially when you talk about urban, that has known a lot of parameters that have impacted. How much can we say that what Dakar is now is to be credited to the project that you started in '72, and how much has probably come from other factors? Senegal is blessed, one of the few countries, unfortunately, in that region of the world with a very nice political stability. But imagine, God forbid, Senegal has gone through some problems like some other countries have been. Would that have been a factor that could have been a factor that could have impacted very strongly the outcome? So my reflection is how much a long-term evaluation can tell us about really the project itself. Thank you.
Could we start with Michael and then pass to Arif?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I think that the question of methodology and analytic framework is very important, but it also depends on how you frame what you're looking at. If you decide that you're looking at a particular project funded by agency X in city Y, you look about how much infrastructure was created, you can do that in kind of a relatively straightforward way. But the broader question about what's the quality of this place to which the project has contributed, without being so much worried about the short-term outputs I'm more interested in outcomes than outputs. If you're not so interested in the outputs. So, I'm reminded, I don't remember if I told you this story, but in the 80s, I was on this project site, and there was a Senegalese mason who was sitting on the ground chipping away at a stone. An elderly man, and as a young guy looked at him and asked, I said, I understand this project is behind schedule. And he looked up at me and he said, according to whom? And the whole point being, why does that matter? Right? Yeah, it matters according to somebody else's agenda, but it doesn't matter in relationship to the creation of this place. This place has a broader significance. And so I think one would then have to figure out in local terms how you would assess this place in relationship to other places and possibilities in that city or in that country. Okay. Of course, there are many factors which go along, which determine things, and so if you can do more rigorous use of samples and control groups and various things, you would try to do that. But I don't think there's one single methodology that would apply to all kinds of projects. I think you would want to work this out, and that's where I think local knowledge is really important. Does it really matter? Does it really matter that at the UN in New York, somebody thinks that a project X in country Y was a success? It matters in the papers, but it doesn't matter in the sense of it matters much more to the people in that place according to their own criteria of assessment. And then the previous question about replicability, of course, is relevant. If you think this was a good experience, what are the constraints to doing more? Getting into the institutional question. So I think we can get ambushed, if you will, by, shorthand, the econometricians who would want this all to be worked out in regression analysis and factor analysis about. I don't think that's the right approach. We could do it, but I don't think we would learn that much.
Ron, over here. And then, okay, I'll start to one here. Okay.
I'm Dave Liebson, retired from USAID and doing various other things. A question that kind of relates to both Dakar and Orangi from the assistance point of view. I guess the question relative to Dakar would have been, if I heard what you were saying, is because of the frightening effect of the short-term perception, we disengaged and therefore were not involved in what might have been the dialogue about form or even development. And I guess so. The question is what happened in Dakar totally? Was it just totally, what's the word, spontaneous, or was there some generator, some other thing happening just beyond just in other words, was that initial investment all that really took, or was there something else happening? And then shifting to Orangi, the question is, supposing 15 or 20 years ago, either the donors or the government had said, boy, this is exactly what we want to do, and had been helping you rather than resisting you, would that have been a help or a hindrance to what actually happened? Both questions coming at, so what really is the role of assistance in these, or what can we learn about assistance here?
In the case of Orangi, I think if the government had said we are going to assist you, and they did say that they were going to assist us at one stage, which we rejected, because unless and until the model is clear, I don't think assistance can be of very great help. I think it can be very damaging, as a matter of fact, as we've seen in many cases. A project needs, if you are doing a project that is experimental, that Orangi was really an exploration to begin with, you also need a period of gestation. And the concept of gestation is something that governments and bureaucrats, by their very training, do not comprehend very well. So we had this period of gestation, and it was only because of that that we were able to expand and create new relationships.
I think in the Senegal case, as in many other cases, there are local processes, local investments, and people moving in and out of the neighborhoods and building this up over time. So the project creates a platform, and then their behaviors occur. And what's interesting is that most of the behaviors occur after the donor has left, all right? And then the donor closes the books somehow and doesn't observe, to the donor's detriment, because the donor doesn't really learn. Right? And I think that's it's a real problem. I remember a conversation with Mr. Wolfenson shortly after he came to the bank, and he went to 2 projects in Latin America to look at two urban projects. And he came back and he said, you know, our people don't know each other, the people working on the 2 projects in the same region, not that far from each other. They don't even know each other. And I don't know, I was feeling particularly glib at the moment or something, and I got in a lot of trouble. And I said, well, you know, you're working in an institution that has a learning disability. You know, and he said, that's not funny. I said, I don't mean it's funny, but the fact is we're not structured to learn about these things. We don't invest in that process sufficiently. And I think that really goes on. There's one other point which I realized I didn't say in the presentation. I asked our students to find out if we could find a single example in the UN system or in the bank where there had been evaluation 35 years after the fact, and we couldn't find any. Okay, we asked people in New York at UNDP and others; they could not find any. I've since asked many people, several of our directors general of evaluation, has anybody seen it? Nobody's ever seen it. So, as a body of professional practice and activity, the fact that nobody goes back and looks at this is simply extraordinary. It's simply extraordinary, and you know, no wonder, right? Things happen the way they happen. But it's kind of a shocking. Well, it's shocking to me, having lived and worked in this environment for such a long time, that we didn't do that. So in part, it's a mea culpa, because why didn't I think of some of these things before? And some of my other colleagues might think the same. Okay, although it may not be so strange to people who were observing the system from outside. So.
Okay, Arish, and then this gentleman here in blue, and then the person at the back, and then you, and then you. Okay. Okay, I didn't. All right.
Begin. Primarily addressed to Pakistan, but it will apply to Senegal. Hello? You got it? Sorry, thanks.
Could you identify yourself?
Oh, sorry, he says. Egon Chalakian, Harvard and Columbia Universities. I want to address the gestation that you cited as gestation, particularly with Pakistan in mind, and Senegal to some extent. Historically, waste management draws organized crime. It's probably its #1 ally around the world, and I deal in organized crime. And South Asia is notoriously famous for corruption and organized crime. How does one mitigate that in that context when you're dealing with government, local, and not so much on the national level, but still local government is just as nasty as national government in Pakistan? How does one mitigate that factor?
Actually, the problem of corruption is there. It is there, yes. The only way you can mitigate it, as we have done to some extent, is by presenting alternative costs. and pushing for those alternative costs through the media, print media, television, channels. And it does work. But there are various levels of this. At the local level, a small project, you can manage to do it. But if you are dealing with huge projects like transport systems, like you are dealing with large-scale trunk infrastructure where there are international tenders being floated, then it is comparatively more difficult. Local contractors and consultants we can manage to some extent. But when you are dealing with the sort of projects we are dealing with now, it's very difficult. So that remains, and you work with it. Learn to work with it.
Do you want to say anything, Michael? Okay. Okay.
Arif Dastoor from the World Bank and Cities Alliance. My question is to Michael. In fact, I was there in February '07 when your students were around. And, not to pick up too much on Farooq's point in this whole question on methodology, but, it struck me then and it struck me now that over 35 years, there are really too many unplanned for variables, and they far exceed the planned for variables, especially in a sites and services project where it's mostly land is designated and most just minimal infrastructure is provided. So the contribution to such a project, to place making, I think that's a little ambitious. Maybe place designation is a more humble way of looking at it, and I think place making is taken care of by all of these unplanned variables. But I think what this project really did, and I really think we need to do more sites and services projects, but I think what this project really did is it designated a place and it got the government to acknowledge the urban future. And just by designating the place alone, it let a whole bunch of other things contribute to placemaking. And I guess it's it's sort of, the terminology placemaking seems sort of, it's what you were bringing up was that global action, local results. It sort of reminds me of that sort of thinking, and that's why I was wondering what you thought about this distinction and I guess probably a more humble approach to what World Bank projects actually do.
No, I think that's a useful. That's a very useful comment. In terms of designation. Simply the making part of it was the basic putting some infrastructure in the ground. It contributed to, as you say, designation, and then over time the place was made in a broader social and economic sense. So I think that makes sense.
Okay. Do you want to? Does that mean? Okay. Okay. Comment.
Tony Kolb from the Urban Programs team at USAID. Two quick people questions. One, in Pakistan, this key middle management person who you mentioned was one of your key counterparts there. I would assume in terms of scaling up that these types of individuals will be very important in taking on this type of working role of working with the people more directly, etc. What is the impediment currently for them to work in this way, and what needs to happen for them to begin working in the same sort of community-based approach that you are promoting? In terms of you mentioned briefly, Michael, the 100 people that were trained in terms of your project. What happened to those people?
Well, what are the constraints? There are many constraints, but they don't have to work with people if they don't want to. They can still promote this model. The model is one of component sharing, and many of the people who are supportive of this model actually don't work with people. They provide the external infrastructure and allow communities to connect to it. But that is not a solution. You need, within local government, people who actually go to the communities and to promote this sort of work. That, I think, can only be done if there is a very major change in the curriculum of training of surveyors, engineers, bureaucrats. And in some institutions that has happened. And we had many people who were happy to work in this manner with us. But one or two things have happened which I think we should understand. One, there has been a big economic boom in the construction industry. So that has taken away all these people, big salaries. Secondly, the NGO movement is no longer what it used to be. It is now really a business. The altruism which produced the Asian NGOs of the 70s and 80s is no longer there. It's a regular business. And the people who head it are those who've been trained in Western educational institutions, where theories have been developed around third world explorations. And that is a very major issue today, not only in Pakistan, but also in all the other South Asian and Southeast Asian countries, this change that has taken place. So there's all the more reason to focus on these educational institutions and their curriculums, especially for para-professional institutions, not only for the professional ones, but especially for the para-professional ones.
Some of the people who worked in that Sites and Service project show up later in different parts of the government, working on different things, but also some of them went into politics, became local mayors and local community representatives, and I think the experience was sufficiently jarring that they went off and interpreted the meaning in different ways, but they seem to have been mostly activists as a result, which is useful.
Okay, this gentleman here, and there is a gentleman in the back in a white shirt who's been waiting for a long time.
I think the issue of project design and short-term and long-term evaluation can be related.
Could you identify yourself?
Sure, sorry. My name is Anjum Altaf from the East Asia Urban Department of the World Bank. I think one of the strengths of the Orangi pilot project was that it was a very different project design. And I think, Arif, it might help a little bit if you mentioned the fact that there was an attempt at one stage by the UNDP to turn it into a more mainstream project design. And one of the issues there was the issue of monitoring and evaluation. And I remember from that time that Akhtar Hameed Khan Saab, the director, had a very unique short-term evaluation format, which he used as a means of involving the community. So I think if you could mention that, that might add to our understanding of project design and evaluation. And to Michael Cohen, just this thought struck me on long-term evaluation, whether you think that the 50 years is enough, is a fair long-term evaluation or not.
Well, thank you, Anjum, for reminding me of this. You know, I have forgotten about that completely. Yes, there was a time when it was decided to turn us out of Orangi because the BCCI Foundation, which was funding us, decided to get the UN involved, and the UN sent a very competent planner. And he came and he said, all that you are doing is wrong. You have to get the contractors organized, you have to get the surveyors organized, you have to plan this whole settlement, we have to go into providing housing support, etc. And he wanted a lot of surveys to be carried out. And just to give you some examples, he said, now we have to have this survey about an ethnic survey, the different ethnic groups that live here, and I want so much money for it. And I told him we are doing for the time being a sanitation program, and I don't think the excreting habits of any of the groups are really different from each other. So that was the first quarrel we had. Then he said that now we want to ascertain how much water is used. So he came up with a huge survey for water. How much water does a person use when he goes to a toilet? And so Akhtar Hameed Khan sent him to me. He said, go and talk to Arif. And so he asked me. So we said, no, it's very simple. We got the vessel that people take. He said, here, this is it. This is what they take with them as water. So over time, these sort of debates and discussions, he said that all right, he wrote a note saying that these people are not professionals and this project should be closed and we will then take it up. So we were more or less fired. But for some reason, the BCCI chief decided to divide Orangi into two, give half to him and half to us. He disappeared along with his big grant that he got after 5 years and after having developed 36 lanes. And we are still there. So the problem was that there was a project that was designed over there, a conventional project. Whereas in our case, we were looking for alternatives. That was a very big difference. That project could not have succeeded. There have been many other similar projects all around the world. So you set up an agency to run that project. The project time span finishes, the agency is wound up, and that's the end of the project. This has happened again and again in so many countries that I have worked in. That was what you were referring to, I think, Anjum. And there was something else you asked.
About the short-term evaluation process.
No, short-term evaluation was very simple.
Cameras, and they were putting pictures before and after. This is a very different method from what the UNDP was recommending.
Yes, yes. No, that also we had a problem. For instance, for us, it was very clear. The evaluation process was the Friday meeting that we had, in which the entire staff was present, and they presented what they had seen. They were assigned their work. If they hadn't carried it out, they were asked reasons for it, and the community members were a part of that meeting. So those minutes formed the evaluation, and the photographs were a part of that evaluation. And so it was a continuous evaluation over many years. We have had other evaluations also. They've not been very good ones, that we have accepted them gracefully.
You mentioned this question, 50 years is enough. This was this campaign that said that the World Bank should be abolished after 50 years. It was enough. I recently came across a comment made by Chou En-lai, the foreign minister, Mao's foreign minister in China. He was asked in the early 70s, what was the significance of the French Revolution? And he said, it's too early to tell. And it seems to me that it suggests maybe we should put some of these things into a longer term and assess whether it's too early to tell or not.
Can I just say something on... But it is really a matter of what determines land use. And invariably, land value determines land use today. And land use changes are determined to a very great extent by land value. Now, in the case that you are mentioning, it would be interesting to know how changes have taken place in the people who are living there. Who are they? Have they moved on? Have they changed? And the nature of densification as well. Exactly what is the nature of densification? Is it high-rise or whatever? In the case of Orangi, in the last 27 years that we've been associated with it, it has changed enormously. It has densified enormously. And there has also been a movement of populations from the areas which are of higher land value, considerable movement out. I think this is the sort of things perhaps that need to be looked at, and it would change planning considerably. Because bylaws to a very great extent in our case determine what happens to a piece of land to begin with. And the bylaws are anti-mixed land use, they are anti-pedestrian, they are anti-street, they are anti-dissolved space. And as a result, these settlements are ideal for for lower middle income groups and middle income groups rather than the lower income groups. So I think that's very much an associated thing with this. And maybe the evaluation should take note of these land use issues.
Absolutely, but I would also say that land value is a behavioral outcome. I mean, it reflects possible choices and uses of the land, and so that changes over time too. So we would want to study those things. I mean, in the Dakar case, there were people who moved out and people who stayed, and it's a mix. And the point is, we're not going to be able to know if we close our eyes after 5 years. We're going to have the perspective of a 5-year-old. Right? So anyway, sorry.
Okay, there's a gentleman. Okay, you've got the mic, so after you, there's a gentleman in the white shirt.
Okay, I'll be brief. I'm Judy Baker from the World Bank. I'm leading a group on urban poverty and urban upgrading, a thematic group. I just, since there's been so much talk about evaluation, I just wanted to briefly mention an initiative that we've been working on for the last few years, and I personally spent a lot of time thinking about how to evaluate the impact of our interventions in urban areas, specifically related to urban upgrading. We have now 10 case studies of projects, they're World Bank projects, where we will have collected baseline data both in the project areas and some other areas, which will be our counterfactual. And we'll be able to look at some of the impacts, a lot of the things that we've been discussing, impacts on health outcomes, welfare impacts, changes in land values, access to credit, women's livelihood options as they sort of gain new assets. Some of the projects will be just during sort of a 5 or 6 year period, but some of them actually we've gotten the governments to agree to sort of follow up with it later. So far, I think the longest time frame we have, it was one project in Brazil where the government's interested in looking at 15 years down the road. But I can assure you that if I'm still doing this in a few years to come, we will be able to find resources to try to continue to follow up on these, because I think the points you've raised are very important. Thanks.
Thank you.
Jaron Wharton, Army Fellow at the Foreign Service Institute. My question is for Dr. Cohen. Sir, it's obvious that the guy on the ground, whether in Senegal, Pakistan, or for that matter in Iraq, sees the impact of well-provided aid. He does so with a near-perfect local knowledge. The systematic problem, however, is reaching these places and ensuring aid is properly allocated. Given the Millennium Goal of getting water to the poor, how do we develop a workable strategic plan for getting water to the poor? Do we pick 10 countries that are moderately developed, that have the workable institutions that we spoke about already, or do we aim at maybe the really, really poor nations that may not necessarily have those institutions in place?
Well, I think first the question is, who is the we, and who is who are the people who are the beneficiaries of receiving water. I remember having the experience of working on the water decade in the 80s, when 550 million people in the world received water supply. In the period of the 80s and the end of the 80s, more people did not have water than at the beginning of the 80s. So it needs to be put into a broader context of growth and what's really going on. It's also clear that the we, if the we is the international community, won't be able to do it. The demands are large, and in fact it's much better if they're local institutions, and whether it's public or non-public, providing that water and developing those things. So I don't believe in a one big strategic plan that fits, that everybody wears the same size shoe. I think that it has to be much more localized, and maybe even down to the neighborhood level, and those kinds of things are really important. The problem where we have tried to have a single plan, a single solution, is that we've oversimplified, and it doesn't matter if it doesn't matter what the intentions are. Frankly, it doesn't matter how well disposed any political set of forces were to improving the situation. It really depends on what the local conditions are.
Just a quick comment and perhaps an embedded question. Michael, you bring out this, in fact, it brought out in all the questions and answers since then, this all-important long-term time dimension. You recall that the World Bank underwent a major shift in its culture when it changed from the input-output relationships to input-outcomes. And I saw that. I used to be serving on the Operations Committee and the Operations Policy Committee, and I saw that as a very welcome change. We're finally looking at long-term returns and long-term outcomes. The problem, of course, and here's where I really call upon your help in trying to define and give us a future. The problem is that the mechanisms within the bank don't allow for this long-term dimension. Country assistance strategies are 3-4 years. Project cycles are 6-7 years, and to declare a project problematic like Senegal, it took us 10 years perhaps, one of the very long-term ones, I guess. So we don't have the mechanisms, I think, at present. An encouraging comment from the back about a 15-year look at Brazil and so forth is very good, but still we're talking about very, very short dimensions. And I think not just for urban planning, but really for the whole gamut of development as a whole. All sectors, integration of sectors, and urban planning is a great example of integration of so many aspects. Really, it's bring out something from the institutions that you work in to advise the World Bank to introduce the mechanisms which will allow for the long-term perspective. Can this be done? Are you willing to do it?
I heard an interesting comment made yesterday by one of my faculty colleagues at the New School who works on games, on how do you teach about game design and computer games and things like that. And she talked about how games teach persistence. That is, people start playing with computer games and they keep working at it until they figure out the answer. Okay? And she posed the question, how do you create an architecture of persistence? And I was reminded in Arif's description of the history of Orangi that there clearly had been an architecture of persistence, of building up a set of behaviors and beliefs and activities which created this persistence over time. All right. But I think that the same thing would have to apply in big institutions. All right. And that we have to persist and we have to really believe in things and keep persisting and enlarging our framework. The problem seems to be that all of these, whether they're career incentives or personnel policies or whatever, people move around, and you believe that if you've worked in 50 countries, you're better than if you've worked in one, and that's just not. That may have to do with you, but it doesn't have to do with development, right? So.
Thank you. My name is Janet Bearden. I'm with the Environmental Protection Agency. My question is for Mr. Hasan, and it involves the local government. My reference for this is I spent last winter in Kabul. Excuse me, as a bureaucrat. I'll be returning in 2008 as a non-bureaucrat when I retire. On the issue of local governments, you referenced that within Karachi you had 18 districts and something like 178 unions, each with mayors and powers. I assume you also had a municipal government. When we talk local government here, are you talking about did you work first through some level of the union government up to the district, up to the municipality?
Local government really started functioning effectively in 2002. Before that, we had 5 districts in Karachi, more or less controlled by the bureaucracy. So we worked with the district in which Orangi was situated, and we worked with the water board, water and sewerage board. But things have changed now. Now you have the town, which is Orangi town, so we work with the town. But the water and sewerage board has not been decentralized, so we work with the water and sewerage board as well. Do I answer your question?
Yeah, it's just there are so many layers of local governments in so many places. I was curious as to where your starting point was.
No, our starting point was with the district of Orangi, in which Orangi, the district in which Orangi was located. This was 1981-82.
So, gentleman here.
Yeah, on the Orangi project, I thought that graphic was interesting, showing the different spheres of politicians, planners, and people, and how the greater the overlap is between politicians and planners, the greater distance between people, you said, and how in the Soviet Union, politicians and planners were almost one, and the distance to the people was infinite. But in fact, in the Soviet Union, I believe cities were rather well planned, and people in urban areas had access to water and sanitation. And in the West too, people don't get involved in water and sanitation. They pay their bills, and they're generally happy with the service. And you said that in Pakistan, the Orangi project, in order to scale it up, would require having more capable municipal governments. So my question is then, why bother on the community-based approach and mobilizing taxi drivers and housewives, and why not focus limited donor resources on improving municipal governments?
I think first of all, as I said, that between local government representatives and the people, you need some form of participatory democracy. Or you need an effective bureaucracy, which we don't have either of those. We had some sort of a bureaucracy, but that has been done away with. And we have a lot of big money coming in, changing the shape and form of the city and it has always been like this, to the disadvantage of the poorer sections. Community participation, getting people together, creating the space, means that people can have a voice in determining what should happen. Have a voice, but they cannot do it themselves. Similarly, as far as the Orangi pilot project's model is concerned, it is very clear that the bigger issues, like to take sanitation, for example, like treatment plants, trunk sewers, this is not what communities can do. But they can certainly influence their design and can create a climate of accountability and transparency. So these institutions are in the process of evolving. In the case of the West, they've already evolved. And this participation is, but I think it is well understood that is required. Everything is in a state of flux, and the direction that it takes depends very much on whether the supposed beneficiaries or victims can influence what is going to happen. I don't know if I've made myself clear.
Okay. Well, I don't see any more questions, and we are coming pretty well to the end of the time that we had scheduled. Well, I have a few questions myself, but I'm going to ask them personally after the session is over. I think this has been a very, very interesting seminar because, first of all, we had a presentation of what has happened on the ground, basically largely as a result of local initiatives, although it was helped to some degree by assistance from overseas, starting a long time ago and continuing even now in Orangi. And then we had the second example of a project which really started with an idea which came from outside the country, gradually integrated itself into the development of the city, and now is being evaluated and considered in the context of all of the other factors which have led to the development of that city in different ways. So we have it from both directions, and I think this question of what happens over the long term, which both Arif and Michael talked about, is an extremely important consideration. And cities will be with us for a much longer time than any of these projects will, and we need to think about their future as well as, you know, the kinds of projects which both inform and impact on perhaps more successful ways of dealing with poverty, development, and growth. These cities are growing very, very quickly. They aren't successfully integrating all of the elements they're made up from. They're very fragmented and they're very incoherent. Perhaps one could say that of North American cities. But these are extremely hopeful initiatives, and they help us to think about both the future and the continuing struggles that are going on in these cities. So I'd like to thank both of our presenters for extremely thoughtful and important papers and presentations and discussions with all of us. And I think we have, even in our own minds as we leave, a lot of very, very important ideas which we can now apply to